Hi, Merritt. How are you doing? Good. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yep. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. That working? Greg, can you hear me okay?
Okay, so I'm going to call this meeting to order. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Inkla, Kapmuk, and Syilx people. There are no late items on public input. Do we have any public input tonight, Mr. Lewis? No, Your Worship. Okay, thank you. We move on to the adoption of the minutes, 4.1, that the minutes of the regular council meeting held April 5th, 2022 be adopted. I need a mover, seconder. Second. Christopherson and White. And any errors or omissions? All in favor? Opposed? None. And I do want to recognize too that Councillor Luck is online. And I may need a reminder to see how he votes. Yeah, I'm looking around here and anyways, thank you for that. There's not a public hearing, there's no general matters, unfinished business. We'll look at bylaws 8.1, Gateway 286 servicing. We need an adoption of bylaws 2312 and 2307. So, Mr. Smith, do you have final words on this?
Thank you, Your Worship. This actually is a bylaw that went back more than a year ago. You'll recall when you did first 3 readings on this as the projects were first being put forward and what that split would look like. As you're familiar with, there's already been groundbreaking on the Spyam portion of the site here. And in this time, city staff have worked very closely with these parties to be able to put a little bit more certainty on what this project is going to look like, to make sure that when it's built out, it is something that is going to benefit our community as a whole, but also that there won't be any kind of kickbacks on the city as a result of development at this site. And that really has been the focus, is making sure we've got a path forward to allow their borrowing to take place, to make sure that that system for how it would be registered to those properties would be charged back, but also to secure things like overages, which is something that council has talked about in the past. So as you're well aware, the local area service and loan authorization bylaw set out an amount of $7.554 million to complete these works, and there is some contingency built into that figure to start with, but costs have increased since that has been put forward. And so as staff, we wanted to make sure that we went back and received a commitment from the parties that they would cover the cost of overages for those works if they do exceed that $7.55 million number. So you'll see that there are letters attached to this report in addition to the bylaws that indicate that commitment. And what we would end up doing, because at this stage, this is the loan authorization and the local area service adoption, yet to come would be there's still 2 steps, would be a process before council to pass a temporary borrowing bylaw so that it would enable the city to borrow against these funds. So this allows the setup and the creation of the local area service, but there's still one more bylaw to come to allow borrowing to take place. And then there's the step after that of actually putting in the request to MFA, Municipal Finance Authority, to do that borrowing. So the key for staff here is that we've secured an understanding with the parties that there wouldn't be any borrowing take place. We would, there's one note that I want to acknowledge here at the start of page 2, where it says staff recommends that council not consider final adoption of any borrowing bylaw until these development agreements are in place. We actually just had another meeting on this morning. That's something of a chicken and the egg statement, because in the development agreement, ideally they've gone through the tender process so we know what amounts we're securing. But they can't go to tender unless they have authorization to use the funds. So what we're actually proposing is a slight amendment to this, that we not do any borrowing before the development agreements are in place, but we do feel that in order to allow that tender to be released, council would have to get to the point in the process where final adoption of that temporary borrowing bylaw is in place. So the next steps that we're proposing, subject to council approving tonight, there's a 1-month quashing period that would take us to May 19th, after which we would immediately send this bylaw out for ministerial approval. Once it receives that certificate of approval, which we anticipate will be a couple weeks afterwards, we would go through 2 processes at that point. One would be the temporary borrowing bylaw. We would also have a draft agreement to bring forward to council at the time of that bylaw, the draft development agreement, but we would need you to know that the number would likely change based on whatever comes through in the tendering agreement, and that's what would be inserted into the agreement itself. But we will bring that forward to you so you see what the bylaw is, or what the development agreement is in substance, and then we'll be seeking staff authority to enter into that once we find out what the tender numbers are. We also, at the conclusion of that tendering process, once we have the numbers, once we've entered into the development agreement, only then would we be looking to actually put in for borrowing on this, so that at no point are we ever borrowing against an unsecured risk, that we would make sure that that's done beforehand. So lots of intricacies with the process, but want to let you know that this is one important step in that, and we've been really satisfied with what the developers have been able to put forward, and to date it really does look like this is moving forward, that the plans are in place to be able to advance these works. So one other point that I think there had been some confusion on in the past, and I wanted to clarify, is that when it comes time to tender this project, it will be a city project. So city oversight over the project. It will be city advancing and using those funds. They will just be charged back to the developers through the local area service.
Okay.
So I'm here for any questions. Otherwise, I'll pass it back to you, Your Worship.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Smith? Councillor White.
So what you're saying is a city project, so our public works will be hired to do the job, is that what you're saying? And then
I shouldn't have turned this off. My apologies. Yeah. Your Worship, through to Councillor White. No, we would tender the project, but this is definitely of a size and scope that's outside of our public works capacity. We would provide oversight for it, so we would have responsibility for that project and accountability to the taxpayers for that project, but it would not be us running it. And even if we approve the tender, there still has to be communication between all of the other parties. There has to be comfort with who the person who would be doing those works are, agreement on the construction services schedule, but it wouldn't actually be city staff completing the project.
okay. Thank you.
Councillor Richard.
So I think just so that people feel comfortable with this, our security would be that by approving this, we have to move forward so that we can ensure that the overruns would be received by the developers at an agreed amount, so that this can continue to improve and develop housing for the areas and grow in these sections, so that this is a way to bring more housing to our area. So I think that's maybe something that we also need to focus on, the positives from this, because I think sometimes people are concerned that we're spending money that we don't have. So just to confirm, for those maybe who are out there and curious to understand that. So
Yeah, it's a great question. And anytime you have a transaction that is not one for one, very clear cut here where we've set up the local area service, it is very important to recognize that yes, there's borrowing taking place, but the cost of that project will 100% be borne by the developers through a parcel tax that's levied against the properties for 30 years.
And only the parcels in that area.
Yeah, that's correct. So it's only on the parcels that are subject to the local area service, which at this point is just 2 parcels.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
And before I go a second time, I'm looking to see if Tony has a question. No?
I'm okay so far, Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Councillor White?
So these services that are going in there, what happens to the services? Are they hooked up with the services of the city?
That's correct. That's why it would be a municipal project. These would be city services that are installed. So funded by the developer, but city services.
So would there be any upgrades to the city service, the current city services that are in place right now through that project?
A smart individual on that. You're exactly right. So if you look at one of the, it's the second from the top paragraph on page 2, there will be downstream infrastructure upgrades that are required as part of this project. So what we're talking about in relation to that 7.554 is only the cost of the new infrastructure that needs to be put in, but that does not include the cost of the downstream upgrades. So let's say we have pipe where in areas as a result of this extra demand load, you would need to upgrade from 100 millimeter to 200 millimeter pipes. The cost associated with that isn't captured in that 7.554. And so what we are proposing is to capture that through the city's new DCC bylaw, which is exactly the intent of DCC bylaws, to capture those downstream or upstream costs of development. And so what we would do is likely it will happen through the development agreement, but we'll clarify this before we bring it back to you at temporary borrowing, is have in the development agreement a form of no build covenant, which says that they can't build until the DCC bylaw, the new DCC bylaw is in place, so that they're bearing the full costs of those downstream costs. And in that DCC bylaw, we'll very likely, again, it's not done yet, so I can't confirm exactly this is what will happen, but should you approve it, and what we are directing the consultants who are working with us on this bylaw to do is to create a general DCC area, but also have a specific development cost charge area for exit 286, because there's a lot more downstream costs that are only necessary for that particular development. And so the funding equations are going to be different for that area than they are for the rest of the community. And so as a result of that, and the developers are both on side with this approach, they're saying, let's just get that DCC bylaw done. We'll have input into it. We'll go back and forth, make sure that the costs, the ratios all make sense. And once that DCC bylaw is passed, we would lift the no build covenant. They would apply under the new bylaw and be paying the full costs for that downstream development. And that's just a much more streamlined way of doing it than an upfront contribution agreement, because very likely this is going to be a build out over the course of many years. Whereas if you do a contribution agreement, you either have to be smart about how you're structuring it, a payment on year 5, year 10, year 15. You have it triggered by certain other events, but it's just way easier to leave it to DCCs. So that's the intent, and we would protect that by way of no build until that time.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? I have one. Can you, this is a loan that we're taking out. We know it's being covered by a third party. But what are our obligations under community charter in order to go to referendum before we go to a loan?
Perfect. So this is exactly what that, and it's in the report previously that I think is Schedule C
Okay,
to this.
okay.
But when you set up the local area service, you have to have the equivalent of a referendum for those individuals that are subject to the service. So because they're the only ones that are borrowing, we've received the necessary approval from those electors to borrow funds and have them pay it back. So there is no requirement to go to the general electors because
Okay.
they're backed by these particular parcels. You just have to go to the individuals that are subject to the local area service.
Thank you. And I see no other questions, so. Oh, there is one. Councillor Luck?
Thanks, Mayor. Mr. Smith, just one question I have for you. You know, with inflation and all the things that are happening out there and everything, I'm just wondering, with all the work that needs to be done in here, and have we had any talks with the two developers? What is their confidence level that they're going to be able to continue with this project and stay within budget? Have we had any discussions around that? Because boy, with inflation and the cost of materials and all those kind of things, it's getting a little scary out there. So they still got a pretty good confidence level that this project will be able to go forward?
I don't want to speak for the developers. And again, where it's a city project, I think it's every bit as important that we have a high confidence level on that as much as the developers. And so what I will say is it will be critical that we get those tenders back and have the right language in that tender so that if this came in at an astronomical figure that would make all of us reconsider this, you know, $12 million or whatever it is, yeah, you may end up hitting pause on this and needing to reconsider. If it's in the neighborhood of this 7.554 or I anticipate it actually could be higher at this point. But so long as it comes in on tender, kind of in that ballpark, and we've got that commitment to overages that is secured, I think that we're comfortable with the approach. But I think that anybody right now would be a little bit crazy to say that they're extremely confident in the tendering world. There was an era where you could, I think, estimate the cost of projects with a much higher degree of certainty than what we see today. But we talk with many professionals that are having a little bit harder time giving that same level of confidence right now. So I don't want to overstate that, you know, we know this is going to work, but we feel that we've got the right process in place to make sure that we don't proceed unless the numbers make sense. And if we do proceed, that the city will be safe.
So I now need a mover that council adopt water and sanitary sewer services to Gateway 286 local area service bylaw 2312-2021. And a seconder. So Etchart and Luck. And is there any discussion here? Seeing no discussion, I'm going to call a question. All in favor? Opposed? None. Carried. And I need a mover that council adopt loan authorization bylaw 2307-2021. And Etchart and Fair. And any discussion on this? Okay, I'll call a question. All in favor? Opposed? None. Carried. Wow, it's going ahead. So 8.2, Official Community Plan Amendment Bylaw 2330 and Zoning Amendment Bylaw 2329, final adoption. Ms. Bradshaw, do you have a report for us?
Thank you, Mayor. I guess this was brought forward and was provided with third reading last council. So staff have prepared the official community plan amendment bylaw and the zoning amendment bylaw. The official community plan amendment bylaw has one amendment which proposes removing the temporary use section. And the zoning amendment bylaw has 96 proposed changes that range from additions, corrections, formatting changes. And we can, we've been through the file, the document that outlines all of those changes in detail. But I am here to answer any questions if you have any.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Ms. Bradshaw? Okay, seeing none, thank you. I need a mover that council adopt official community plan amendment bylaw number 2330, 2022. So I think that was Christofferson and Etchart. And are there any comments on this? Seeing none, I'm going to call a question. All in favor? Opposed? None carried. And I need a mover that council adopt zoning amendment bylaw number 2329, 2022. Etchart and White. And are there any comments on the zoning amendments? Yeah. So seeing none, I'm going to call a question. All in favor? Opposed? None carried. Now we're moving along to 8.3, which is now presented for adoption. And on the officer designation and delegation amendment bylaw number 2331. Mr. Lois.
Thank you, Your Worship. This was the procedural amendment to the officer designation bylaw to allow the planning department to implement the new temporary use regime, which you have just adopted in the zoning bylaw. That, of course, was tweaked in the last meeting. So if you have any further comments, questions, or concerns, this is your opportunity to essentially ask staff questions. Or if you're content with it as it stands, as you just voted it into the municipal legislation, then adopting this bylaw will allow that to go forward.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Lewis? Seeing none, I'm going to ask for a mover that council adopt officer designation and delegation of authority amendment bylaw number 2331, 2022. Christofferson and Etchart. Anybody want to speak to this? I see no one. All in favor? Opposed, none carried. Wow, moving right along. And we're now brings us to new business 9.1, 2022 grant in aid, additional request, the Merritt Curling Club. Mr. Anderson. Oh, Mr. Thompson. Staff report.
Thank you, Mayor. We have a proposal from the Merritt Curling Club for financial aid for $7,500. And we have members from the curling club here to answer any questions that Mayor and Council may have for them. We've also got in our budget for this year $40,000 for the roof replacement. But in addition to that, we had some consultants come in and gave recommendations. In addition to the roof replacement, there's a cost for outdoor stairs and railing are a safety hazard and are not up to code, and it'll cost $3,885. And they would like a removable wheelchair ramp to the ice surface, cost of $1,365. And to ensure safety in the club, they would like to replace the indoor exit signs, outdoor emergency lights, smoke alarms, and bring up to code and to be more energy efficient by replacing the fluorescent fixtures with LED lighting to interior and exterior lighting at a cost of $17,829. So the total program will be $23,079, and they're asking for $7,500 in financial aid.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Thompson? Seeing none, I'm going to ask for a mover that council approve the grant and aid request for the Merritt Curling Club for $7,500 for financial aid in May 2022 from the council contingency fund. Fair and Etchart. And anyone want to speak to this issue? Councillor Fair.
Yeah, just to throw my voice of support in for this, as well as the vote for it. I think this is a long-standing asset to the community, and something that none of us would want to see go by the wayside. So I hope this will help achieve that.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, Councillor Etchart.
I have similar comments to Councillor Fair, that with our curling club having such a long history, that I think it's important that we support this so that they can continue to improve and continue on with the club. I know that a lot of different events have happened over there, and I think it's the thing to do. So thanks.
Okay, as they said, I'm in agreement. Yeah, we don't need to repeat that. It looks like we need to move to the recommendation that council approve the grant and aid request for the Merritt Curling Club for $7,500 for financial aid in May 2022 from the council contingency. Oh, we already have a mover and a seconder. I'm sorry. What I really need to do is call the question. I'm sorry. All in favor? Opposed? None. Carried. I just thought we'd try a second time, see if it was a different outcome. Yeah. So thank you. Now we move to 9.2, Strategic Priorities Fund, Capital Infrastructure Stream, application for Voght St Phase 2. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Your Worship. I want to also thank Stephanie Moore, who is working both as our economic recovery advisor, but moonlighting as our grant writer right now. And so would like to thank her for the work. I'm largely just presenting the work that she's put into this report and want to make sure she gets the credit for that. Our recommendation is that council does direct staff to submit an application to the Strategic Priorities Fund for the Voght St Phase 2 project. You will recall we've moved a whole bunch of different directions on this project as we had applied through the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program. We're unsuccessful as part of that grant back when the project was estimated at about a $7.5 million cost. The feedback that we received from that was, for the size of the community, we were probably asking for a little bit too much. They really did recommend that we split that in two. So we split the project in two, and we intended to have a phase 2A and 2B, or 2 and 3, however we want to call that. When this opportunity came up, we spoke with the funders, and their recommendation was actually that we apply for the full project. I don't know if that is sympathy for our current circumstances. I don't want to speculate too much, but there was a recommendation there that, hey, really give strong consideration for applying for the full thing. We have also set it up such that we would highlight that this still is a 2A, 2B. If there was a need, you could split this out. So we will leave that on them, but apply for the full amount. The grant itself is, it's the second go around for this grant. It's quite unique in its terms in that it allows for up to $6 million, so larger investments, and the funding is 100% as opposed to the 76.6 that we saw the last time we applied under the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program. The other unique factor to this grant is it is a stackable grant. So we get the 6 now, and it looks like 3.7 in overage is what council would need to commit to today. But as we would likely be building this out over 2 different years, even if we were successful with this grant, 2023 half the project and then 2024 half, largely the funds would likely be used to cover 2023, and we could continue to be applying for grants over the course of the next 18 months to cover the costs of the back half of the project. So we wouldn't be closing the door to further grant opportunities is what I'm trying to say, despite the fact that we are asking for a commitment to cover the city's share of the project. The reason we say that is, as we'll find out in Wayne's portion here, is 3.7 would be a big hit right now. We would be scraping in order to make that happen. We likely could make this work just by virtue of our DCC bylaw being updated by that point and allocating a bunch of the costs that we have in DCCs to this project. But I want council to understand that it's significant. I'm not trying to downplay that, but we do have some time to try coming up with additional funds if we were successful. The grant is really quite broad in what it allows, so it's anything from road, water, sewer, to your drinking water systems, to fire infrastructure, to recreational infrastructure. So it's one of the most broad grants we've seen. We do suspect, and again from the funder, that this will likely be about 5 times oversubscribed. That's what the last one was. So it'll be a very competitive grant, but on the strength of some of those comments, we're going to stick with what they're saying and recommend to council that we put in for the full project and ask for $6 million to complete that, probably the most critical infrastructure upgrade to our main thoroughfare through town. Happy to answer any questions that council has. Otherwise, you know where we stand.
This is open for council questions. Councillor Christopherson.
So basically this is not going to happen, well, if it happens, 2023, 2024. It's in pretty rough shape right now, Voght Street, so
Yeah.
we have the funds to
Yeah. So
do something this year.
do want to make it clear, we're trying to be very strategic in how we approach things this year. Part of what you will be approving at budget time, maybe have already approved through early capital approvals, was an asphalt replacement program, of which a portion of that is to make immediate necessary repairs on Voght Street. That isn't going to take care of the infrastructure underneath the road, but it will allow for asphalt replacement program in and around the Grimmett area where it's particularly problematic for this year. And so we're trying to make sure that investment is proportionate to the risk of it maybe needing to be taken out again next year if we were successful with a broader project. But yes, there would be works done this year to make some immediate improvements on Voght Street.
More than just filling the potholes.
More than potholes. It would be taking, not along the whole strip, again, that would be a much more expensive project, but we're talking about taking those most problematic areas and retopping them entirely.
Good, thank you.
The ones we often hear about.
It's getting in rougher and rougher shape all the time, and it's a bit of a hazard driving that area right now because everybody's dodging all the holes that you're never quite sure what's aiming at you.
Yeah, it is a problem. We recognize this is way beyond just pothole filling, and quite honestly, this has been really challenging for staff because we know that you've got this big project in the wings. We understand that there's a fairly good chance that the costs of that will be covered, but at the same time, we've got immediate needs. So it's finding the most appropriate Band-Aid to place on it to bridge until we can have the larger infrastructure project run.
Good, thank you very much.
Councillor Richard.
I'm definitely in support of something like this, especially since we had already planned on applying for this before, and of course the project was too big. How long, so if we apply for this now, what's the cutoff for this? Is it this summer or it's to apply now, but
Yeah, the funding announcements are expected in early 2023 is what we anticipate. So it would be enough time for an announcement to be made to be included as part of our capital plan for 2023 and get probably half the project done that year.
yeah, so if we had a commitment of 3.7, if that was the whole thing, maybe we would only have to budget for half of that.
Yeah, I think that depending on how they would force us to report this, I think there's a good chance that we could take all of the potential grant funding, front load it for because it's a 100% grant, we're not required to do a matching contribution.
Okay.
I think we could probably front load the entirety of that for 2023, carry over whatever is left over for the back half of the project, but continue to seek additional grant funding because it's a stackable.
Stackable.
So
Yeah.
yeah, we're riding a bit of a line on that, but I think that that's the best strategy we can come up with to try and maximize these dollars.
Well, really, I mean, why not? If we're gonna have to pay the whole thing and pay the whole shot ourselves anyway, and what do we have to lose? We get declined and we're in the same boat that we are now, so it just makes sense to apply for it and hope for the best.
Councillor Fair.
I think my question has been answered through the discussion here. Thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Luck.
It's just so happens that in the National Post this morning, there was an article in there. It says federal government warning provinces to use billions of dollars in infrastructure funding or lose it. I found that a little funny this morning when we've been denied funding in the past and everything. So here's hoping that this one goes through and gets done, because as Councillor Kirk pointed out, there is that we really need that road fixed sooner than later, and those potholes are getting pretty bad up there. So fingers crossed on this one, and thanks for all the work on getting this application in. So fully support it.
There wasn't a question in there? Okay, we're looking for a mover and a seconder that council directs staff to submit an application for the Voght St Phase 2 project through the Strategic Priorities Fund Capital Infrastructure Stream. Christopherson White. And anybody want to speak to this? Well, we all spoke earlier. Okay, I'm going to call a question. All in favor? Opposed? None? Carried. And that mover that council support the project and commit to the city's share of the project costs of 3.7 million carried over 2023 and 2024 budgets. So Etchart and Fair. And does anyone want to speak to this? I had one question on the words commit to the city's share. If it's 100% paid, why are we committed to the city's share? What, did I miss something?
Yeah, we perhaps could have used alternate language, but the city's share of the project is anything over and above 6 million.
Okay.
And so the estimated cost of the project is 9.7, city share is the 3.7 above the 6.
Okay, got you. Thank you. Seeing no other questions, seeing no other comments, I'm gonna call the question. All in favor? Opposed? None? Carried. Did I have a mover and a second? Yes, you was. Thank you. Moves on to 9.3, Committee for Post-Election Remuneration. Mr. Lois.
Thank you, Your Worship. This is everyone's favorite topic. It's generally considered good practice that elected members, wherever possible, don't vote on their own pay. As a general rule, communities try to get it so that essentially the elected people in term one sets what the remuneration will look like after the election, and so on and so forth. That avoids concerns about, say, conflicts of interest or just general. It's generally better. So part of the last remuneration bylaw that you adopted included that clause that in the second quarter of a year with a general local election, a committee to be formed with size and membership to be determined by council to consider and recommend remuneration for the members to be elected later in that year. So essentially, we're now at the point where we would be asking you to consider, with all your knowledge and experience of this role, what an appropriate level of remuneration would be for whomever gets elected after the elections in October of this year. We've included a recommendation in the report as to what the terms of reference of that committee should look like, and that you create a 3-member remuneration select committee with those attached terms of reference, and then appoint members to it. Obviously, if you wanted to do it in any other way, that is entirely up to you. The bylaw itself doesn't give any guidance on how the committee should be structured, so that's purely a staff recommendation at this point. The bylaw itself does require the committee to be created at some point in the second quarter of this year. Again, it doesn't have to be at this meeting, or of course you could always, if you so chose, amend the bylaw in question. So that's essentially where you stand at this point, and I'm obviously available for any questions.
Are there any questions for Mr. Lewis? Doesn't look like there's any questions. So I need a mover then that council create a 3-member remuneration select committee with the attached terms of reference and appoint members to it. Okay. Who did we have? We had Fair and Etcher. Okay, we have a move, and I'm just wondering if we wanted to split maybe this motion and look at the terms of reference and then appoint members afterwards.
That's entirely reasonable. Yep.
I'm looking at the mover and seconder. They've already moved in second, so it's going to stay as it is. Neither of them are moving it. So on this 3-member remuneration select committee, how does council, do you want to discuss it? This is the time to do it if you do. Okay, seeing none, I'll call a question.
Your Worship, if I may, with apologies. I know you were talking about breaking it up, but if you are going to be voting on appointing members to it, then I would very much appreciate knowing who those members would be. So if you have any volunteers or voluntold.
Thank you. Anyone at this point want to volunteer for it? Okay, Councillor Christofferson, Councillor Etchart, and Councillor Fair. There you are. Thanks. Yeah. Okay, and I'm going to, Councillor Fair.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment and say that I think this is the right time and probably overdue for this type of motion or this type of bylaw to be put in place. I think it, as has been explained by Mr. Lewis, it takes away some of the, I guess, just improper feelings from folks about how remuneration is decided. So I'm just happy to see this coming through.
Thank you. Anybody else? I don't see anybody else, so I'm going to call a question. All in favor? Opposed? None? Carried. Okay. Move on to 10, notices of motion. Okay, seeing none. Reports from council. Councillor White.
I just have we finally are getting West David from the Wild West fishing show coming on May 10th to the 14th.
Good. Good. Anybody else have a report? Okay, seeing none, I'm moving on to 12.1, our draft 2022 operating and capital budget. Just when we thought we were very close to the end of the agenda, we now look at our operating and capital budget. Mr. Anderson, floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I'm sure this will just be a few minutes to get through, but there's quite a few pages here, and the intent tonight is not to go through in fine detail, but if you do have questions as we go through where you would like us to come back with more detail on specific line items, let us know, and then for the next meeting we will have that analysis for you. There's lots of stuff that goes into putting this together, so today it's an overview of the 2022 only operating and capital plans. Normally it's a financial plan that runs for 5 years, and future meetings will have the 2022 to 2026 financial plan. Lots of things happened this year. I said 6 months that our team's been working hard for. It's actually only been just over 5 months, but it seems like 6 months. And they were working hard prior to that 6-month period as well. So lots of new roles, new members. We have Norman on board here, and we've had a lot of transactions go through finance, probably about tripling our volume of transactions through the flood there. About $6 million in claims to Emergency Management BC that are getting processed and claims being submitted for. So it's been busy for finance staff, it's been busy for the IT staff, and everyone else, the front counter, the phone support, having to deal with many difficult conversations and doing so with great compassion. It's been nice to see, you know, everyone stepping in finance and IT. So we got a meeting coming up on the 25th. It's a 3-hour meeting, and that one there we will go in more detail. We need to have public input, and that would be our opportunity for the public to come and provide input on this document and stuff that we've got put forward in the plan here. So that's on the 25th. And at that time, hope to have more information on reserves and surplus balances for the start of 2022. Our auditors are still working on the 2021 financial statements. I thought maybe by today we would have some stuff, but not quite today. So I'm sure by the next week we should have some indication on where we stand for opening balances. The 2022 capital review, it's got a breakdown of projects. Some of them have been approved already through the early approval, and those are indicated on that schedule as well. It's a very scaled back 2022 capital plan, and the goal is again today to go through it in some high level, but if there are specific projects you want more detail on, we can have directors and managers here for the next meeting to discuss those. So as I mentioned, I mean, it's just imperative that we continue to build our reserve funds through these operating surpluses that we're trying to gain through these budgets that we put forward here in order to maintain our assets. As we talk about the Voght Street and potentially having to put $3.7 million of our reserves into that project in 2 years, we need to make sure that we're, you know, not eating away at what reserves we have today and actually putting some aside for those kind of projects as well. Lots of schedules here. The ones that I'm going to focus on are the ones that exclude the capital. The financial plan, Appendix A1, includes everything, including the capital items, and that balances to zero magically. But the ones that exclude the capital are the ones that I want to focus on, because that kind of shows what we're putting from an operating perspective to the bottom line to the operating surplus, which then flows to the reserves. So that's what I want to spend some time on today. So we're going to start with revenues. We're going to then go into property tax and then look at the expenditures and capital. So I think I'll probably just go through each section, and then as we're done that section, if you have any questions, we can go from there. So on the second page is the draft revenue plan, and it's compared to the 2021 amended plan. And again, this excludes any capital grants, primarily in the revenue side. So this is just operating grants, taxation revenue, licenses, fees, those sort of things. So you can see that between 2022 and the 2021 plan, we're up by 2.3 million. And about a bit more than 50% of that comes from areas other than property tax. So increases to government grants, some increases to sales of services. We're seeing some getting a little bit more back to normal on some of the recreation side, for example, getting some sales of services for the water dispensing, sewage disposal facility that we put in place. So those things start to come online a bit more in 2022. Taxation, it is the elephant in the room for sure, and it's a $1 million revenue increase, and we'll get into some detail on property tax to discuss that one. Parcel taxes, which is parcel taxes help to fund the maintenance of the infrastructure that runs in front of everyone's properties, and if you do abut to the city water and sewer, you have a parcel tax on your roll, and it's $200 for a sewer parcel tax and $160 for a water parcel tax. So have not adjusted those from last year. As we discussed prior, we want to have a rate review and go through some of these things, and that would be an ideal one to take a deep dive into as well. There is a few additional parcels as subdivisions are developed. There's a few new parcels that get added on, probably about 15 or 20 last year. But I have adjusted it downward slightly just in case there are some rolls that are removed due to the flood as well. So that's the revenue from tax and parcel tax. The government grants, so included in that government grant figure there, you will see a number of grants. Some of them flow right through to reserves. For example, the Community Works gas tax funding of $372,000. It's pretty wide open nowadays what you can use that money for, but it gets another entry that moves it over to the reserves. So that's where it ends up, and you'll see it on the adjustments entry a little later on. Things like small community grant, $500,000, that's just free for us to use for operations in general, no restrictions on that money. We get included in there is traffic fine revenue sharing of about $90,000 per year. Some other larger grants, that's Strengthening Communities grant that we received, which I think was about $360,000. There's still about $316,000 that we can recognize this year that we haven't spent yet. Development services and economic development, a whole bunch of grants in Don's area there. It is quite a beast to go through them with him and figure out where they all land, but there's some great opportunities there for us to do things in the city, and it's spent in a whole bunch of different areas, and it ends up on the expense side of the equation too. So shows as revenue here, but then you'll see development services, I think, is $500,000 over last year's plan. That's because we got another $500,000 to spend on certain things. Two items there, the $130,000 and $113,000. So that's $243,000 out of that $24 million that was announced. There's $243,000 that is operating related for the 2022 plan. So there's not a whole bunch of money there that we can just freely spend on operations. There's lots of stuff in there, and I'm sure Sean would go through it in a lot of detail on the 11 million here and 5 million there and 3 million here. But when it comes down to operations, other than funding the operations of the recovery center and the team and so forth, there is $240,000 that we've added into our plan here. One of them is for lost taxation revenue of $130,000. So covers roughly a couple of years of lost taxation revenue. And then lost utility billing revenue. You can recall that we did a credit for Zone 4, and there'll be another credit coming up on the bill coming up here in the next few days or weeks for the first half of 2022 as well. So some funds there to offset that. So $2.3 million in grant funds is included in our revenue. There's regional grants that we receive, about $330,000 for fire and transit services for Thompson-Nicola Regional District, and also for the Lower Nicola Indian Band as well. Sales of services, we are over the 2021 plan on that, and some of the items that are causing that overage, if you like. The $160,000 in increased revenue for sewage disposal at Trans Mountain. So over and above what we had in the plan in 2021, we've got another $160,000 in this year's plan. We've got fire service revenue for Trans Mountain support. We did start that last year, but we didn't have a full year of it. So this is the increased amount to cover the full year. Obviously, on the wages side, there's increased costs for the 2 firefighters that we hired as well. More aquatic center revenue, some more transit fares. So that's kind of the summary of some of the increases on the sales of services. On the downside, lost revenue for Claybanks RV Park. Now we do have some revenue that we get through insurance. So we are covered somewhat for insurance, I think up till about June. But we are not covered beyond that, and that's lost revenue there. There's also savings on the expenditure side as well. We did see some reduction in garbage and commercial fees, water fees and those sort of things in the second half of 2021, so we've notched those down a little bit as well. So that's a little bit of a summary on the sales of service ones, and there's other areas in there as well. Licenses, permits, and fines, 61,000 higher than the 2020 plan, and primarily development services. There is increased activity. There was in 2021, and there's going to continue to be in 2022. We didn't have a really, substantial 2021 plan. We did increase it, but they really went and blew that one out of the water. So we did knock it down a little bit because of the exemption zone that we have for phase 4. But even with that, there's 20,000 more in building permits and 50,000 more in zoning and DPAs. We did see a little decrease in dog license revenue. We're budgeting down about 7,500 on that, and that might need some more communication. Just seems to be the online stuff. Maybe not enough people know about it, and we just need to get that out there a bit more, but the revenues have been budgeted down a little bit on that. So that's the revenue side. If there's anything on that schedule on page 2 or anything that I've mentioned there that you'd like to see some more detail on, we're going to get into taxes here in a minute, but is there anything anybody wants to hear more about in future meetings?
Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Anderson or comments? Doesn't look like any at this point in time.
Okay, all right, so starting on page 4, we are going to go through property taxes and some comparative information. So assessed homes in Merritt increased by an average of 29% for 2022. The proposed rate decrease, so our mill rate with an increase that we're talking about on the overall revenue, the mill rate would be reduced by 14.75%, where it was 4.6244 in 2021, would be 3.9421 in 2022. So to come up with an 8% tax increase on existing residential properties, and also use the same 8% on existing business, industrial, light industrial. So starting the year out, not taking into account any non-market changes, so any new construction, working with the existing base that was on the books in 2021, taking an 8% increase on those existing properties, and factoring out the increase like 29% in residential, 40% in business increases in assessment, just taking an 8% total increase in dollars collected from each one of those classes. That's what we use to come up with the rates that we've got here today. So where we collected or had budgeted for 4.3 million in residential revenue in 2021, we're budgeting for 4.8. That includes 8% on the existing plus all the non-market changes at the newly established rates. There is a $223,000 in additional revenue that's added on to the utility side through the revitalization tax exemption recovery. As you can recall, what was previously known as Merritt Green Energy, but does now have a new name, had a tax revitalization exemption. This is the last year for the exemption, so that will come off for 2023. But the impact of adding that on in 2022 was another $223,000. So there will be an additional add in 2023 because this is their last year of getting that exemption. There are, if I look at the total revenue on the table on page 4 there, taxation revenue by class, So the year-over-year increase is 12.7%. So we go from a budget of just over $8 million in revenue from all the classes to just over $9 million. The tax rates by class, so you can see that the rates have dropped for residential. They will drop for heavy industry, light industry, and business as well, based on the fact that their increases were higher than the 8%, so in some cases quite substantially higher than 8%. When we look at the bottom of page 4, the residential tax, so if we look at the tax base for 2021, the 4.3 million, there's 70,000 in there that relates to new construction or additions, so 17% of the increase in taxes relates to that. The 347,000 relates to the tax change on existing households. So that 347,000 on the 4.3 is an 8% increase. So that's the 8% calculation. And that's shown on page 5 at the top there. The 347 equates to an 8% increase. So based on an 8% increase to existing homes that have an average assessed value, and I'm using the 2021 number of 323, the increased municipal tax on the average house would increase by $119 in 2022 compared to 2021. So these numbers are only average, and some may be more and some may be less than the average amount. Just to note that the homes that were impacted by the flood did have assessments, were reassessed in the February-March timeframe. So their values are going to be, in some cases quite substantially less than they were in 2021. So they will see a net decrease, obviously, in their taxes for 2022. On the business industrial side, combining businesses, utilities, major industry, light industrial properties, they are up 16.4% in revenue, so 603,000. Now that's made up of the 223,000 non-market change for that tax revitalization exemption. There are non-market changes in there of 81,000, so new additions and things like Barkman Concrete and so forth. And the remaining 298,000 is the 8% increase. So combining those classes, about $300,000 on the existing base. Some comparative stats starting on page 6. We've used this in the past, what we call our gold standard communities, and we take communities similar in size to Merritt that have recreation facilities, have policing services where they pay 70% of the policing costs, and we've done this comparison on these in prior years. So for 2021, the rates that are readily available there, and then also some approved 2022 increases. Some of these may be approved and some of them may have been proposed to their council and not approved, but what I could find, it was roughly averaging around 4.8%. So taxes and parcel taxes combined in Merritt, 2,655 in 2021. The BC average was 2,715, and the average for those gold communities was 2,708. So in 2021, we were below the BC average and below the average for what we call our gold standard communities. One note on the bottom of page 6 there, Smithers had a 10% increase in 2021 on their assessment, on their taxes. Not sure what their rate increase was for this year or what's been proposed. And beyond the gold standards, there's a regional comparison here on page 7. So that shows, communities from Princeton to the Okanagan and other areas, kind of picking communities that aren't I guess, outside of the Kamloops to Kelowna to Osoyoos type region. So take the Thompson Okanagan, take the TNRD into account. And 2022 estimated increases, we can see a couple there that have some larger ones. Penticton had proposed an 8.5, not sure if that one was the final one that they landed on, but I know they started out at 8.5, and discussions with them. It related primarily to policing and bylaw services driving a large part of that increase. Oliver at 9% was factoring in they are moving to a population of greater than 5,000 and would have policing costs. So they built into their tax increase the cost of additional policing as well. So seems to be a couple there that are policing related. The average taxes and parcel taxes on this regional group is 2,690. Again, we're at the 2,655. So we're just slightly below that average for that group. And the BC average again is 2,715. Average increase roughly about 5.4% on the ones that I could find numbers on. Total taxes and fees. So on page 8, when you take into account the fees, which are most cases water, sewer, garbage fees that have been incorporated into the rates, our rate is 37.58. The BC average is 41.14, and the combined with this gold standard group is 4,095. So our water rates are a bit below the average. It seems like 900 is the average for additional user fees across that group. So when you combine that in, we're a little bit less even. That is the property tax discussion at this point. I'm sure there's lots of questions, and those are the comparatives that we have.
Are you prepared to take questions at this point? Do we have questions at this point? Councillor Fair.
Thanks. Just one question regarding the Revelstoke user fees, and they look quite a bit higher, so I'm just curious if you can give me some indication of that one.
Yeah, we'll dig into that and see why they're kind of skewing it, aren't they? Yeah.
I'm just curious, so yeah. Thank you.
Ski Hill? No, that's residential. Okay. Any other questions? Councillor Etchart?
I had to bug you for a question because if I don't, people will wonder if I'm asleep. So I am, of course, pouring over all this stuff and I just eat it up and enjoy it. But I was wondering, when will we get the final numbers back from BC Assessment? Do we have that already, or is that coming for?
Yes, to Councillor Etchart. These are based on the final assessed numbers. So this is the assessment that we received at the close to the middle to the end of March. So we do have the final numbers with the adjusted amounts for the flood impacted properties, and I believe that when I looked at the numbers was about $60,000 to $70,000 in tax revenue impact.
Okay, well, that's good to know, because I know looking through the numbers, like I can see, well, Merritt's parcel is a little higher than average, but on some of the other sections, it was less. But knowing that, I think that's really a positive thing that we have. The mill rate was able to go down, because since our term has come in, the mill rate started out at 5.32 and now we're below 4. So that's a positive. So that goes to show that we're spreading it the right way, I think. So no, that's really good. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Luck, did you have a question? Or
back to one of the ones, I think it was Castlegar. I think you said they had a 10% increase in their, was it Castlegar or Smithers? Sorry. Yeah. That'd be another one. It'd be interesting to know why. I don't expect you to do the work or anything, but it'd be very interesting is what is driving some of these larger increases. Is it infrastructure costs that they're starting to experience in these communities? I think you mentioned one already is policing. I mean, what is driving these huge increases? I mean, are we artificially holding these down? These ones are finally getting to the realization that infrastructure costs are catching up. It'd be a very interesting way to know what's happening in those communities, other than the policing piece, right? So just an observation, yeah.
But when I looked at that one, I think it was only about $20,000 to $30,000 increase for policing, and it was a lot of infrastructure. I can get you the details on it, but it was roads and those sort of things that they needed to increase taxes to fix, obviously. So
we've been saying for the last couple of years here, you know, you can only put some of this stuff off for so long, and keeping mill rates down and taxes down, but that is going to catch up to us sooner or later. And it looks like it's caught up to a couple of these municipalities there. It would be interesting to, you know, like I say, see how they're dealing with it. Well, tax increases, how they're dealing with it, but not some fun stuff coming up, I think. Thank you, Wayne. Appreciate that.
okay.
Councillor White.
When I did my research on the water, when all the water restrictions were happening, Revelstoke has pretty much a year-round water restriction. So why would theirs be so high?
You know, it also includes garbage and sewer too, so it depends if they've got some things there, and maybe they've got some stuff built into that rate that is more like our parcel tax versus an actual tax, so, or a user fee. So I'll dig into that 1417 and find out what they've got, but you know, it could be high garbage fees and those sort of things too.
I just wondered if you know, if they have that restriction, that year-round restriction, if it's just water, why it would be so high, but okay, thank you.
Any other comments at this point? Okay, thank you. And Mr. Anderson?
Okay. So starting on page 9, looking at expenditures, again, excluding anything from a capital expenditure perspective, there shouldn't be anything in this expenditure section that's capital anyway, but we've got a plan here of just over 20 million in expenditures. Last year was 17, and 2020 was 17.8, and 2020 was 17.1. Now, 2020 was heavily revised due to the onset of COVID at the 17.1 level. We also revised 2021 based on COVID as well, and there are some adjustments down below there that explain what we did in that area. But yeah, so those plans had a little bit of a COVID impact to them. 2022 is, you know, back to a bit more of a normal year, if you like, probably. Hopefully normal year. Let's touch wood here that it is going to be a normal year.
It is going to be a normal year.
Yeah. So there's a, you know, when you take out some of the grant, we did have additional grant funded expenditures. I say 1.1 million there, but that's not all in the variance because we did have grants obviously in 2021 as well. But we know that we've got a good number of grants this year over and above what we had last year. So there is variances to explain here. Every 1% increase in property tax brings in about $82,000 in revenue. So if you were to take $820,000 in expenditures, you would need a 10% tax increase to cover that. So that's just a little bit of math for us there, and that's based on 2022 opening numbers for property tax. So the following table below there broke it down somewhat between staffing or personnel costs, some inflationary cost increases, and some other cost drivers as well. So one of the biggest ones, or the biggest one, I guess, is the RCMP staffing costs. So there was a contract increase for the RCMP that drove the annual cost per member by about $16,000 per member. We have 17 budgeted members for the city of Merritt. So when you take those numbers combined, that really what drives up that 326,000. We don't budget exactly to 17 members because they don't get to that 17 and stay at that 17 for the entire year. If we were to budget for 17, this would probably be about $500,000 to $600,000 more. So we start the year out, first quarter, they started the year at about 15, just under 15 members. So the first quarter we did 15 members, and then we did 16 for the second quarter, 16 for the third quarter, and 17 for the last quarter. If they get to 17, I would be surprised, but we kind of average it out for the year. So that's how we come up with the budget, and even at that averaging, we're $326,000 higher. That's 4% tax 4% tax impact when you use the $82,000 factor. We added some new positions, and there's a payroll section in here that comes from that previous report, and taking about a $60,000 average per position, that's roughly $240,000. So there is some increase due to staffing. There was a wage increase, a union agreement, and a factored in management increase of 2%, brings $108,000 on top. The next item there, adding back COVID-related staff savings for recreation. So when we looked at the recreation budget in 2021, we were looking at it at the time of COVID when they had some facility shutdowns, and we knew that this was going to be a longer term event. We took the overall salaries, roughly about 700,000 for 600,000 to 700,000 for recreation, and talking to the director of recreation. So based on the fact that not going to have a full complement for the year, and we're trying to keep our tax rate increases at a minimum, what can we pull out? And we stayed within that budget. We pulled $175,000 out of the wages budget for 2021, and we stayed within that as well. But that sort of thing where you make those budgeting decisions, and maybe shouldn't have made that decision, maybe should have kept the 175 in there and had a surplus, but we were looking for ways to save in 2021 because that was an increase from 2020, and we wanted to make sure it was minimized as if possible because we were still in COVID. So adding that back in, that's about a 2.1% increase as well. And then we've got in our budget here a little bit more because we still have recovery teams and those sort of things to manage on the IT side to maintain that. And then the recruitment side it was over budget in 2021, and it still becomes a challenge. So we've added on more to the recruitment budget to accommodate that. So that is $800,000 in staffing there. On the inflationary side, now you'll see like 2.5% for inflationary cost increases, and we know that inflation's running more like about 5%. So reviewing budgets with department managers and directors, and for example, if they had a $10,000 budget and they'd only spent $9,000 or $9,500, we kept the budget at 10, let's say, which factored in a 5% increase. So the budget didn't change. But it was really a 5% increase because we knew that they were going to probably come in with a higher amount. So when you take enough of those situations where they were under budget in 2021, we bring them back to budget, or we take them 2% higher than budget. That's what the 2.5% increase is. So we do have some notable things that we know. Our property insurance premiums, yes, they went up about $40,000 this year. So that was a 35% increase. Fuel and oil and parts and those sort of things, we just know that. Line painting costs were an additional $15,000 this year. So stuff we know that has increased, there's a couple $100,000 there. Some other things that we've added into the budget, there is a potential that about $1.5 million that we have in Emergency Management BC claims for 2022 that we need to send in claim submissions for may have some that are rejected. They normally get rejected when the rates that were used on the invoices from the vendors weren't at Blue Book rates. Those sort of things the province can push back on. Based on the first submission that we had returned, there was quite a few things that they red circled for us. So we have in 2021 factored in nearly $700,000 in potential amounts that we will not get reimbursed for. We're hopeful that we're going to see more than that. It's not going to be 700, but using a 15% factor on the $4.5 million in claims in 2021, we discussed it and we've allocated roughly $700,000 onto the financial statements for 2021. If we end up getting all but $300,000 of that, then we'll have $400,000 on 2022 to the good. So we set aside potential there that we're not going to get it all, and we did that again in 2022 as well.
I just add one comment on that.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you. I do want to add that while we are making every effort to get that number as close to zero as possible. Or two, even if through the EMBC mechanism we're unable to do that, there are other levers that council has the ability to pull on. I don't think there's any desire to make Merritt ultimately bear extra costs for response as part of this. That being said, you can only budget for a known quantity right now, and while we think that by virtue of the efforts of council and staff to improve on that recovery, we can't count on it. And so that 15% impairment is the recommendation from our auditor, and our commitment is to do everything we can to beat that, but we've got to budget it in. So.
And having said that, I hear that EMBC and the ministry is looking at making changes for future events. So right now, it may not help us at this point, but they are looking at other communities and other events and trying to streamline their process and add extra individuals to help with the whole processing of these payments, and including it may mean more auditing of the reports. I don't know. But they're looking at revising their system. It just won't happen during our time, unfortunately.
Yeah, we're really hopeful that we have a positive budget variance on this one, but we're just being ultra conservative when it comes to these numbers here. Decreased Claybank's operating costs, so without having a contractor there and without having costs of managing the facility, we do actually save money. The net revenue that we tend to get out of Claybanks is about $100,000 per year, just for your information. Some increased transit costs and the new transit agreement, which will be coming forward to council here very soon, is around $20,000. You did see we have some revenue increase expectations there as well. Somebody asked the question about how much it costs to run an election. We did have about $1,500 in the budget for 2021, just in case there was anything that we needed to do. And normally it's about $15,000. So you'll see a $14,000 increase there. That is the cost of running an election. And it seems to be across the board. Conferences are coming back, whether it's staff or council. There are some additional conference costs in here that we had budgeted last year and probably didn't go to many of them. And this year there's a few more that we're going to be going to, hopefully. So that's a summary on the expense side. Before I go to payroll, which is just a recap of previous discussion, is there anything on the expense side that you want to see more information on?
Anybody have any information that they are not looking at here that would like to see? Any comments on what we have seen so far? Any questions for Mr. Anderson? Councillor White.
I just have a question on the election budget. If this is an increase in the budgets, what'd you say, $15,000? That's how much?
I'm sorry if I did say 15, it's about $1,500. We just had a small amount in there just in case we needed to do something in that area. We normally budget $1,500 a year, but when it becomes an election year, it ramps up to about 15,000. So we don't reduce it down to zero in a non-election year, but about 15,000.
I didn't realize it was that low. I thought the cost was a lot higher than that.
You can run it cheap when you use staff.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, thank you.
Would you guys find it just to stand on the flagpole and ask everyone raise your hands?
Sure. Mr. Smith.
To make one point here, the costs themselves are largely driven by your election staff. Historically, we've ran fairly lean throughout all advanced voting procedures. And so while the raw economic cost that you're seeing is the 15, when you factor in the amount of staff time that is allocated towards this, if we were to do actual cost accounting, it's wildly higher than 15. So I don't want to create any expectation that elections are cheap. They would be substantially more than this. the only costs that are captured by this that go towards any additional staffing is I believe it's a $2,000 stipend for the chief election officer and a $1,000 stipend for the deputy. So it is,
That's the grant we receive.
yeah, you're paying a lot more than that, but it's in existing staff costs that are being allocated towards that, whereas they would otherwise be doing other things.
And this is probably not the year to ask finance to looking at putting cost centers for things like this. I won't even go there.
Okay. We have a few of those going around. But yeah, they are good for tracking this sort of stuff. 16,300 is the budget for 2022, and we had 1958. Not sure where we came up with that number in 2021. Maybe some training or something along those lines we had in 2021. So 16,300 is your budget. Starting on page 10 and 11, this is taken right out of the meeting that we had on March 8th. So it's all of the information around those 4 new positions, 2 temporaries, 2 permanents, and then some changes across different departments when it came to FTE allocation between casuals and full-time and so forth. So if there's any more questions related to payroll, if you had a chance to look at this and still have some questions, then let me know and we can go into it in more detail at a future meeting, but we went through it once.
And I don't know if there's any questions, but the RCMP number is on city employees, not RCMP officers. Just. Any questions on the staffing and payroll? You have mentioned it on page 11, Wayne, but their development services had 1 full-time and 1 part-time position approved last year. They never got added into the budget until now.
Right.
Which makes our 4 FTEs, I don't know, it just looks high. We already had them in last year. We had the approval last year.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't start the year at that, but at the end of the year, it definitely was up in position for sure. So from end of year to start of the year, I guess it's not a position, it was there already.
Yeah. Anybody else? No. Seeing none? Okay, we'll move it along.
Yeah, so page 13, 2022 capital. So the capital plan, it's based on projects that are primarily grant funded or necessary just for ongoing operations. So there really isn't much in this 2022 plan that's discretionary in nature. It's $5.2 million, which includes carry forwards from 2021. You'll see some projects on this list that you would have seen last year and you're wondering why they're there. Because we didn't do anything with them, they are there again. 1.9 million is funded by grants, 335,000 from debt, which some of it's already been approved, and the balance of 3 million comes from reserves. So the reserve and surplus continuity. So the 2022 plan in Schedule A1 has a section in there that's called Adjustment for Cash Items. And it shows the proposed surplus of $310,000 for 2022. So using the excluded capital schedules that are in the package, you'll see on the one that excludes capital, that includes everything else. We have a $310,000 surplus when you look at the operating side. So when you look at revenues, you look at expenditures, we're $310,000 to the good. We've got a transfer in of $372,000 out of revenue, which was that Community Works gas tax money. So you got the 310, you've got the 372 that go towards that surplus that go towards reserves. So we increase our reserves by $682,000. We've got a funding request here from reserves of $3 million for this budget. So if we were to hit everything on plan and had that $310,000 surplus, we would have 2.3 million that we pull from reserves in order to fund this, which is a fairly conservative capital plan. Now, we know in reality we'll have a bigger than $310,000 surplus. We budget conservatively. We know our revenues are going to come in as planned. They're fairly predictable. We have this $700,000 in 2021 for EMBC costs and $225,000 in 2022. So hopefully we get some of that money. So we could feasibly end up with a $1.5 million dollar surplus to add on to that 370. But we're still not probably going to get to that $3 million level, which is what we're requesting to spend from reserves to fund this 2022 capital plan. So just highlighting the items there, that the plan itself requires $3 million in reserves. We've got 372 that we transferred in from the revenue side for the community works that go to reserves, and we've got the $310,000 surplus. And we get some from borrowing, and since we have amortization above, we remove it from below because it's a non-cash item. So that's the thing to note here, is the potential impact on reserves. And I thought maybe I would have some information on that for this meeting, but I don't have the opening reserve balance, but will for a subsequent meeting.
Thank you. And Mr. Smith, did you have a comment?
Thank you, Your Worship. Two brief comments. The first is that when we're talking about a $3 million capital spend coming from these accounts in order to cover just over 5 of expenditure, that is excluding recovery operations. And so you will note that most of what we just had come in for grant funding and the capital expenditures that are going to be required to run those are going to be added into the budget when the time comes. This is as close to what we can get as a non-recovery picture as possible, because we felt that you need that for year-over-year comparison to be able to look at what's happening. And the assumption is really, and it's proven so far, is that the capital expenditures are going to be funded entirely through other streams. So we feel fairly safe with that assumption, but do know that when this comes forward for final adoption, these numbers are going to look wildly different because we're going to be running much larger capital plans than what it actually is showing here. This is just the non-recovery portions. The other thing that I want to highlight for you, and we will definitely talk more about this on the 25th, as to why we're making the recommendations, why we're building in, implicit tax increases here of 8%. You'll note that surplus deficit figure of 310,000 is what we're projecting. I want council to know that that's after amortization. So we're talking about, we are planning to have a total of $672,000 allocated to our capital program. In 2018 dollars, our asset management plans that we've worked to collate indicate about $6.5 million is what the city needs to spend in order to maintain and not increase our infrastructure deficit year over year. So where we're at right now, roughly 680,000 is what we're planning to transfer. And as Wayne said, the way municipal budgeting works, we will run a surplus on that figure. Even if that surplus ends up being significantly larger and we add another 1.2 million or 1.4 million to that figure, it still only brings us to about the $2 million area. You grant leverage the heck out of that, and you might be able to get to 3 million, 3.5 million in spending. But the message is that we're still short. In order to run the capital plans that this city needs to run, we need to pull on a lot of levers, and thankfully DCCs are going to come in future years as one of those levers that's been underutilized, but not one of these solves the problem on its own. And where we are right now, we need to get to the spot where that operating picture gets better every single year. And you'll note that last year, the projected surplus was only 172,000. I think that in full disclosure to you, as staff, we should have been raising even more of a red flag than we did. We probably needed to push harder. Tough year with COVID. We talked a little bit about it, that you got to make these tough decisions, otherwise you're going to see spikes. And while 8% I don't think is the world-ending spike when you consider the inflation and the RCMP increases we had this year, we want you to know that while we are doing everything we can to drive the revenue picture, and I think that it does paint that well, that more than 1.2 million dollars of our operating is coming from non-tax sources. So we're looking to drive council's plan through non-tax sources as on both the operating and the capital side. The number that surplus needs to increase at a more aggressive rate than what we're seeing here, and what's proposed I think is it's still not where we need to be.
And even if it's not where we need to be, we don't have to go directly just to the taxpayer. We can go to the new construction, the new development, the new...
100%. And I think that that's one of the good news stories in this, is it looks on that taxation line like you're looking at a raw 1 million, but over 400,000 of that is non-market change. And admittedly 225 of that 400 is from Merritt Green Energy and the one stage being removed off their tax revitalization exemption. But the non-market changes are playing a bigger factor, and that ramp will continue. That's everything that you've directed at us, and it's what we're pushing for, is to see more non-market change year over year so that tax base grows. That's part of what you approved in relation to an Exit 286 development earlier this evening, and others, and we'll continue to ride that and work to attract more industry so that the answer is not always going to be taxation, but the answer does always needs to be that surplus figure is growing from its current spot. If next year we're recommending a budget surplus of 310, we've failed. We need to find ways to keep stepping that up and make sure that we never go backwards on that figure, because we are riding way too close to the line of just basically covering operating and drastically underfunding capital, which is not this council's problem. It's a systemic problem that was made worse by the loss of TOLCO, of tax revitalization exemptions. We've gone through in prior years kind of a cavalcade of scenarios that have brought us to where we are today. It doesn't change the fact that we're the ones that are going to need to dig deep and in some respects have the residents dig, and that's never a popular thing to do. I just think the numbers sort of speak for themselves when you look at this as to where we need to go versus where we are.
Thank you. Are there any comments, questions? Councillor Fair.
Just want to sort of see if I have a simplistic understanding of those numbers. Because what I'm hearing is that we're at about half of sustaining the infrastructure, like before addressing the deficit. Is that sort of a really simplistic way of being almost accurate?
Yeah, I'd say that's it's probably a fair comment. I think that it's difficult on any individual year analysis, but what we would like to bring to you on the 25th, the Committee of the Whole, where we can kind of dig into this a little bit more, is look at it over a multi-year period and do some analysis there. And again, you'll find that, as you've indicated, Travis, even if our surplus at the end of the year ends up being, 2.7, victory 2.7, it's falling there because you're running a small capital program, less than that 6.5 million to start with. If we were to, we're falling millions of dollars short of meeting our infrastructure needs year over year right now. Yeah. And I'm really happy to report that I think we're seeing great success in our grant programs. The challenge has been that our grant program success has largely been in new infrastructure as opposed to repair of and replacement of existing infrastructure, which is where a lot of our cost is adding up. So instead of replacing things we need to do, we are adding to the expenditure line and having that offset by grant revenue. And so even though grants have been a huge help, it's actually in some respects made the picture more difficult because you're spending money, let's say on the West Merritt Active Transportation Project, where you wouldn't have otherwise spent it necessarily, even if it's hugely leveraged. So grants are absolutely part of the answer, but when it comes to the raw infrastructure deficit that we need to make up, too few of the grants are for replacement.
It's, the tax base.
Councillor Luck.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a couple of questions and observations as we go along here. I guess this could be preparation for the April 25th meeting as well. And so what are the standards for surpluses in city budgeting? I find it a little bit of an ingenuous situation to be hoping for surpluses and hoping we have the money that we can fix our infrastructure. It doesn't seem like the way we should go about it. Just ask that question. And to me, it looks like there's something wrong with the optics as well. So if I'm a taxpayer and I see a surplus of $3 million, guess what my question is going to be? My question would be, have I been overtaxed? It's just an optic thing, right? And so the question is there other ways of doing this? Do other cities have reserves that are set up and we actually budget part of our budget to go into those reserves on a regular basis? To me, that seems like more of a logical way to do this. Then it's transparent. We know what we do. We can set up to know so much money is going into those reserves and surpluses as we go along. And so those are my questions. I mean, I don't think Mr. Anderson needs to answer. He could probably come prepared on the 25th to maybe give some of those answers on that one, but it just seems a little strange that we're hoping for a surplus that we may not get.
Councillor Luck, it's a combination of the transfer to reserves and the year surplus. So the 372 that we transfer to reserves from that community gas works. Yes, we probably should be transferring on a regular basis $500,000, $1 million out of our expenditure side to those reserve funds. And when all we did this year on this plan anyway is just take that 372 that we receive for the community gas works fund and move it over to reserve. But yeah, communities do that. They will fund their reserves on an annual basis. So they are putting $1 to $3 million a year into reserve funds. And yes, they might be pulling out $3 million, but they've already accounted for putting in that $3 million. So we haven't built that into our budget. If we were to build $310,000 of transfers to reserves, we would have a zero surplus at this point. So we don't have room to do that at this time, but as we get to the point where we have room to start doing that, then yes, it's good practice to make sure that we have those reserves in place. Our reserve and surplus policy states that we should have reserve balances at the start of the year that would cover the subsequent year. So we're not at that point right now, right? But that is what the policy says, is that you should always be in a situation by the end of the year to be able to fund the capital for the next year. So you're not always in this, continual situation of trying to find out where those monies are going to come from.
Why don't we just build them into the budget process? 1% tax increase is going to be for reserves or whatever it is. And then to me, that looks like it's a transparent budgeting, and then we know that we can account on that money coming in. If we get a surplus, that's over and above our reserves being funded as well, right? Isn't that the way other cities do it, or am I?
Yeah, you're correct there. A lot of them have a 1 or 2% asset fee right on their tax notice, and that money goes right to the reserve account. So yeah, that is the way a number of communities will do that as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Mr. Anderson.
There's a couple of different ways of looking at it as well. We budget the full FTE for every position for every department. So the chances of there being surplus is pretty high because not everybody works 365 days
We do factor in a little bit there when we know that there are positions that are vacant. We will have a 1 FTE, for example, but we might only budget like half of that position. So we do at the start of the budgeting process if we know there's vacancies, but you don't know during the year that you could have 5 or 6 vacancies. That will definitely add to your surplus when you do have those, and we want to, you know, not be too tight on that. But if we know, for example, that we're not hiring somebody till June, then we're not going to budget, you know, full year. We'll budget a half year, but a 1 FTE, we'll put that into the approval process.
To be consistent year after year, in my world, you have to look at the full budget for the FTE. Otherwise, your comparison year after year just goes out the window. I'm not quite sure what your comment was, Mr. Smith. Did you have something on this particular issue? And then I'll get back to you, Councillor White.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through to Councillor Luck. I think that you're dead right that we as staff would love to see more upfront transfers to reserve. The challenge that we face right now is there's so little wiggle room in our budget to make those transfers. Again, where you're only looking at a $310,000 surplus, and you must be a zero-based, or you must be a revenue neutral budget. Like, we can't budget a deficit. We only have $310,000 to play with right now. So even though our expectation is that the surplus will be significantly larger than that. And again, I would say that this year there's even more factors that probably play into that because of the EMBC impairment factors that we've included. We're in a position where you just don't have enough to allocate to really make that clear difference while still being not running a deficit at the budget stage. It is one of the disadvantages, I suppose, of being a municipality. I think it saves you from running into financial problems, but the provincial government can just do what they expect to happen. And if we were to do what we expected to happen, we could write a $1.8 million surplus and pre-transfer it in advance as to where it would go. But we just aren't in that position.
So I'm harping back to Smithers that have got a 10% tax increase. I wonder if they've run into the same thing. It was infrastructure, they're having to catch up, and maybe now they're just biting the bullet and they're actually budgeting it into the budget and getting hit hard. And it's not pretty. But thank you. We can talk some more about that on the 25th, I guess.
Thank you. Councillor White.
The roads that were destroyed in the streets that were destroyed in the flood, are they a part of this budget, or are they separate? Will there be separate funding for them from the government, or?
There will be, and already has been. So of that 24.7 that was allocated, roughly 12.5 of that was for recovery projects, and of that, a fairly good chunk of it can be allocated to different road projects. So for example, the project itself for Canford is expected to fall in around the $2 million range, which would put the city's portion through DFA in and around the $400,000 range. It was actually just a little less than that, but there were some betterments like curb, gutter, etc., that were built into that project. So the funds that we've received will cover the city funded portion of those road projects, while DFA will cover the non-city funded portion. So our expectation is that we will receive new roads, new infrastructure. We will just be required to cover the cost of those betterments, but even a fair bit of that is covered in the funding we've received.
I was going to say over the 15%.
Yeah.
10 to 15, depending on what it is, I suppose.
Yeah, and so I don't want to overpromise at this point until we get terms back. How flexible is this going to be in terms of the allocation to betterments? But it does look like there will be support to put us in a strong position moving forward, and we won't always be in a position of just putting back exactly what was there. We'll be able to do the right thing, make the upgrades to our infrastructure, increase pipe sizes where it makes sense, so that we're not having to do work twice.
So are those betterments in this budget or not yet?
They aren't, because the recovery projects largely aren't in
Okay.
this budget right now.
Okay.
But they will be in on April 25th, Committee of the Whole?
Not promising April 25th, but
Okay.
May 3rd.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, there's still so much uncertainty from our side,
Yeah.
even the revenues that we got as to what that looks like. Expense side expectations are a little bit clearer, but we're working through that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Anderson at this point, or even comments, I guess? There's no motion to be put to the table. This is just for information.
Yeah, so if I can carry on, financial risks there. I mean, John Smith went through most of them here. I mean, the fact that you're aware of all of the operating expenses and schedules and the impact on reserves and so forth. So that's all covered through the discussion we just had there. And the options discussion here were to provide some direction or guidelines to us as we prepare the 2022 to 2026 financial plan. And I've got some notes here now, and we will be adding in the recovery capital items and the recovery expenditures offset by funding that we've received to help cover those as well. What we wanted to present today is really kind of just general operations, a little bit of recovery in there for the EMBC stuff, but trying to keep it normal type year. But we'll layer on top the recovery stuff, and there's going to be lots of that. So. Others that we consulted through this process, as Sean mentioned, we did have some deep discussions with our auditors as well going through the plan, and they're very supportive of us putting forward a proposed 8% tax increase, and even feel that it could be higher, justified the fact that we aren't really building up those reserve balances and surplus balances, but they're supportive of the 8% at this time. I was hopeful to have some draft financials today, not today, but we'll have them probably by the end of the week here. That'll give us an indication where we stand for the ending 2021 surplus and reserve balances. As mentioned in the community charter, section 166, we need to have a process of public consultation regarding the proposed financial plan before it's adopted. So we're going to be advertising, if we haven't already advertised, for the April 25th meeting for input on the 2022 financial plan and tax rates in that committee of the whole meeting. So that is a 3-hour meeting that we've got scheduled for Monday the 25th. And we've got subsequent meetings then going through the full-blown draft 2022 financial plan on the May 3rd meeting, Tuesday, May 3rd. Tuesday, May 10th is the financial plan bylaw and tax rate bylaw for 3 readings. So at that point, potentially scrubbed up plan at that point for first 3 readings. We have a special meeting on the 11th of May for the auditors to present the 2021 financial statements, normally done ahead of adopting the financial plan bylaw and tax rate bylaw. And then by the end of that week, the 13th, the week of the 16th, we have a whole bunch of things that we need to submit to the province related to our financial results. And our hope is that May 16th or May 23rd, we will be mailing out property tax notices, which would be due on July 4th. And that's all I got.
Thank you. Are there any, are there any other comments, questions for Mr. Anderson or Mr. Smith on this? I think as I'm not thrilled about the 8%, but I know how hard that you and your team have gone through this financial plan. I don't know how many times, but a lot. And I appreciate the fact that we are still less than the average on other gold standard communities, those that are in our area and in our same situation. So I appreciate that. It is what it is. This is not a normal year. And I appreciate all the effort that you have put into this to this date. So thank you and your staff.
Thank you. And we did a review of the last 3 years. So if you take an 8% in 2022, a 3.4 in 2021, and a 1.1% in 2020, the average is 4.2 over 3 years. And 2020, we also had a increased utility discount as well. So it was almost a net zero year when you factored in the utility discount. So it's been running at about 4.2% over 3. So.
Thank you. Last chance for any comments? Going once, going twice. Thank you very much. And this is the